Hello and welcome back to Histories Tech, and today we are looking at the M1 Abrams, the long-promised tank that I have talked about bringing to you. And this tank holds a very special place in my childhood. My brother served in the United States Marine Corps and was an M1 Abrams mechanic, and I had the opportunity to actually get to mess around with one of these, so it's a very special tank to me. I know I've spent a lot of time talking about the predecessors, the patents and things like that, and what led to the eventual development of the main battle tank. So it's time we go ahead and get into why the M1 Abrams was developed. Now, as I've stated before, the main predecessor to the M1 Abrams was the M60 tank. And of course, the M60 was the United States' first second generation MBT, or main battle tank. And this was and absolutely is still an amazing tank. However, even just a few years after the M60 came out, the United States started looking at its replacement already, as the M60 was more of a stopgap measure for the next generation of tank for the United States. And of course, that replacement tank was supposed to be the MBT-70, which was this really interesting joint venture between the United States and Germany to create a standardized tank that could be sent to all NATO nations, and then from there be specialized by the individual NATO nation, but the individual tank could be one basis for everyone to use. And this was a really incredibly ambitious idea, but it really horribly failed. And the United States, not wanting to waste the millions of dollars they had already poured into the development of the MBT-70, decided to use the basis of the MBT-70 to develop the XM803. And what ended up happening is Congress felt like this was another failure and decided to, instead wasting another $20 million developing the XM803, to start with an entirely new tank from scratch. So in 1972, the Main Battle Tank Task Force was developed under the Tank Automotive and Armaments Command, or TACOM. And basically, this group was designated to develop the United States' next generation battle tank. And they had a series of very simple requirements. They wanted it to be able to hit any Soviet gun from at least 2,600 feet. It had to be armed with a 105mm gun and a 20mm version of the M242 Bushmaster's chain gun. After all of the wants and needs of this new tank were ironed out, the proposals were sent out and two companies responded. Both Chrysler and General Motors proposed their own XM1 prototypes. Now, both met the armament requirement by having the M68E1 105mm gun, however, they differed from there. The Chrysler version utilized a more powerful but less fuel-efficient gas turbine engine as opposed to GM's diesel engine. Also, the GM model had better overall armor protection and better fire control systems. Add that to the fact that the GM design was largely complete by 1976, and the United States Army wanted to utilize the GM design. However, when the Army tried to get approval for the tank, the Deputy Defense Secretary Bill Clements and Director of Defense Research and Engineering Malcolm Curie decided they didn't want this tank, and instead they wanted a tank with a turbine engine. And essentially a political move, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld went ahead and signed off on a gas turbine design going with the Chrysler-designed XM1. Basically meaning that Chrysler wasn't even supposed to have the tank in the first place. However, the fight between Chrysler and GM would actually continue for the next couple of years, basically coming down to costs and improvements that eventually won Chrysler over. By 1979, 11 XM1 prototypes had been produced and given to the United States Army based on the Chrysler design. By the time the full M1 Abrams went into production, it actually had some very heavy critics in the early 80s. There were seen as a lot of problems with the tank, that not enough testing went into it, and that it was very much a political decision to go ahead with this tank. And in fact, only within a couple of years of its development did the United States go ahead and start looking at its first upgrade for the M1. And this led to the development of the M1 Abrams tank, which moved from a 105mm gun to a 120mm smoothbore gun that became the mainstay of the M1 Abrams. And even with all these issues, it wouldn't take long for the Abrams to finally see its first true action. And the M1A1 would be called into conflict during the first Gulf War during Operation Desert Storm. And the M1 Abrams truly showed its abilities by taking on Soviet-era T-54s, 55-62s, and T-72, the imported version. And it was actually shown that they actually really were effective against these tanks, not only attacking them, but very few managed to even damage or really hit the Abrams during this time. And in fact, most losses of the Abrams during Desert Storm was actually due to friendly fire. There are several reasons the Abrams had an advantage over its competition, such as the fact that Soviet tanks at the time only had a range of about 6,600 feet versus the Abrams effective range of 8,200 feet. Additionally, the Abrams gyro stabilization system inside of it meant that the tank could accurately fire while on the move, something that other tanks had a difficulty doing. Now, following the events of the First Gulf War, the United States immediately began updating the M1A1 to the M1A2 package, with most of this being digital upgrades to include digital maps, full set of controls and displays linked to digital data systems, and commanders having their own independent thermal viewer and weapon stations. By the time the Abrams entered service during the Iraq War, they were better prepared and more upgraded for the next generation of warfare against tank-to-tank combat. It is during this conflict that a serious flaw is discovered with the Abrams, and honestly, it's something that nobody even thought of. This is basically due to the fact that the Abrams was being utilized inside an urban environment, something it was not designed to do, as this was designed to take on Soviet-era tanks in an open battlefield at long range. And it was discovered that these tanks could not handle close-up tactics, especially against short-range anti-tank rockets. One major upgrade came from the Tank Urban Survival Kit, or TUSK. This basically added armor improvements, shielding for the guns. Eventually, some of them would actually get a remotely controlled weapons platform on top of it. And after the Iraqi War, the United States is actually not going to utilize the Abrams as much as combat as their allies will. Iraq will actually get a few supplied ones for them for their military. The Saudi Arabians will use this, and of course, more recently and controversially, the Russo-Ukrainian War will see the deployment of some Abrams tanks. Unlike the M60, which has an absolute ton of variants made in every possible configuration, the M1 actually doesn't have a lot of variants. Some of the most prominent include the M104 Wolverine, which is a bridge layer, and now its replacement, the M1074 Joint Assault Bridge system. Both of these utilize the lower chassis of an M1 Abrams minus the turret in order to be an armored bridge layer. Another unique variant is the M1 Panther II, which is a mine-clearing vehicle which can be operated both with a crew inside of it or remotely controlled from behind. Now, one variant I'm very partial to is the M1150 Assault Breacher vehicle. And this is basically a roadway clearer. It's designed to remove IEDs and mines from the pathways and allow troops clear movement. There have been a couple of other attempted variants that didn't make it, anti-air, anti-ground kind of variants. But more importantly, the M1 Abrams has become the basis for a lot of tests and development. There's been more than 24 variations on the M1 Abrams to allow different gun platforms, different designs, even internal designs like seen here on the surrogate research vehicle, which was designed just to determine the best configuration internally for the tank. Now, in terms of the future for the Abrams, there have been several attempts to replace it, such as the Future Combat Systems Manned Ground Vehicle, which was originally a singular platform designed to replace multiple tanks, including the Bradley and things like that. However, this program didn't go with the DoD's budgets, and it was abandoned. While the United States is looking at fielding the M1A3 Abrams, they're looking beyond that with something known as the Abrams X. This rather ambitious next generation M1 would utilize a whole lot of next generation technology, including AI support, a fully electronics drivetrain supported by a diesel engine to drive that drivetrain, new composite armor with an overall weight reduction from 71 to 60 tons. But with this, the Abrams really does have a long future ahead of it. I don't see it going away anytime soon. And I know some people will try to come at me with oh, it has all these problems in Ukraine. Yes, it does. Some of those issues have to do with we kind of nerfed these tanks to prevent a lot of their more classified design elements from falling into the wrong hands. Honestly, I could talk about the Abrams a lot more, but to be fair, I don't have an hour to do that. So I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you the next time where we will start up with different types of jets.